Well, welcome back to The Messy Podcast, a podcast about the messiness of life and the transforming power of the gospel. This week, we're going to do another installment of the kind of new thing I'm trying out with the I've Got a Question installment. And it's sometimes these questions are so complicated, I need multiple people to help me try to figure this out. So I've got both Jason Kovacs and Tim St. John with me. Hey, guys.
Hey.
I'm really excited about this just because, I mean, not just do I enjoy podcasting, but I think we enjoy just hanging out, period. So if we could just do a Zoom, well, it's better in person, but if we could just do a Zoom and have an excuse to hang out and talk, I'm super thankful for it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us together again, Scott. This is good.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who may not know, if you're not familiar, Tim serves as the counseling pastor at Lighthouse Community Church in Torrance. He's a graduated master's seminary and completed counseling certificates through ACBC and CCEF. And his passion is to see the grace of the gospel-centered counseling grow in local churches, which we're going to kind of talk about that context during our time today. Jason is the executive director of the Gospel Care Collective. He's a member of Certified Counselor of ABC. He serves on the Council for Biblical Counseling Coalition and the board for the Canadian Biblical Counseling Coalition. Our resident Canadian around here in Southern California, Jason.
Yes, representing as best I can.
And Jason's been doing pastoral work and biblical counseling for over 20 years. And one of the things I want to, so the big question I have today that I want us to kind of wrestle through is where should biblical counseling take place? And by where should biblical counseling take place? I'm wrestling through the context of the local church, through various different counseling ministries. I know that both of you in one sense have ministered in various different contexts and capacities. Right now, Tim, your primary context is the local church at Lighthouse, right? And Jason, I know you're deeply involved in your local church, but your primary counseling ministry is a part of Gospel Care Collective, right? Essentially a parachurch counseling ministry.
Yes.
And so I just want to, I think that a lot of people who practice biblical counseling practice it in all sorts of different contexts. And I want to wrestle through a little bit of is there an preferred context? Is there an ideal context? Are there certain contexts that have benefits and drawbacks? Like, how do we think through where biblical counseling takes place? And so maybe we'll just start out with, I'd love just your guys' initial thoughts on whether or not biblical counseling should take place primarily in the context of the local church, right? So is it a ministry of the local church? Is it an independent parachurch ministry? Like, how do we think about where biblical counseling fits?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I can start by saying I think yes, it should primarily happen in the local church, and that's I'm speaking as someone who is sort of not doing it primarily in the local church, but I'm really passionate about that. In fact, our as part of our ministry, we're trying to help see biblical counseling happen more and more and more in the local church. And so I think a big part of that is it comes back to our ecclesiology, how we understand or what we understand the church to be and the nature of the church. So that for me really sort of answers that question or makes that question or the answer to that question simple. It's yes, the church, like that's Jesus' bride. And so I don't know what I'm doing apart from the church. I don't know what to call it, but I can explain a little bit more, but yes to your question.
Okay. So, well, actually,
so humble. Thanks, Jason.
So I think that actually maybe, and I want to get into some of the dynamics at work there, because I think that it's not just you, Jason, right? I think there's ways in which that's true for all of us, but maybe it'd be helpful. Tim, I'm just going to go ahead and assume you're going to answer yes as well, right? Like, should biblical counseling take place primarily in local church? Yes. I think I don't know, trickier
sorry,
question.
can I just add, though?
Trickier. Sure. Okay, I'm going to assume
Sorry,
your
I
answer,
just
and
wanna
that's not
say-
fair. So go ahead.
No. Well, I just want to say, like, I think for any listener, I don't know if this is their first Messy podcast, but like, I think it really is important to define biblical counseling, and like we define it as a discipleship ministry. So, like, I think whether you're parachurch or church ministry, it's a discipleship ministry designing to minister to people in significant seasons of sin and suffering. It's like discipleship in significant seasons of sin and suffering, that it's like, pointing people to Christ. So I think if it is discipleship, then that's why we think primarily local church, because we're thinking discipleship, making disciples, and that's kind of that New Testament model. I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, actually, so that's actually super helpful. I think even both thinking of it as a discipleship ministry, but also I think that sometimes we don't, it's super helpful for you to remind us of that, because I think sometimes we don't get clear about what the difference is between what we're talking about as counseling, right? And just regular discipleship in the context of the church. And so you're kind of categorizing it as addressing seasons of particularly intense sin or suffering. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, that's how I characterize it. I mean, then I think proactively we all need relationships of care all the time. So then that's But so there's always ongoing discipleship in Christian community. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's the particular focus of biblical counseling is trying to address particular troubles.
Oh, okay. So before we run off into where should this take place? This is actually really helpful, Jason. Are we talking about the same thing when you're talking about biblical counseling? Is that what you're talking about too, or would you word it similarly or different?
Yeah, no, I really like that definition, because when I think about biblical counseling, I do think about it in the continuum of discipleship as well. It's not something separate. It really is, and I love what you're saying, Tim. Like it's particularly focused on those seasons of struggle and sin and suffering. And so, yeah, when you look at that through that lens of discipleship, which you absolutely agree, it comes back to the question maybe too, like, does discipleship primarily happen in the context of a local church? Yes, and what if you don't have a local church? Discipleship is then evangelism, which is his primary goal is to see an establishment of the local church. So that's how I would look at it. Like, whether you're doing the counseling or discipleship within, in an already established local church, or if you're doing it alongside or outside, it should always be towards discipleship, which is being a part of a family, which is being a part of the church. So it comes back, for me, it comes back to that all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's what's really helpful to me about that is that then when somebody says, I maybe I need counseling, right? What we're saying is that's kind of an admission, at least in some sense, of I'm going through a particularly difficult season of sin or suffering or whatever. That there's something unique about this season that needs intentional, maybe increasingly intensive attention in a discipleship relationship.
Yeah.
Okay. So if that's what we mean by biblical counseling, what do we mean by in the context of the local church, right? Like, so when we say that biblical counseling should take place in the context of the local church, right? Are we saying, the meetings need to happen in a building? Are we saying it needs to just happen between Christians? Like, what are we even saying?
Yeah. I think, there's a few things there. Again, coming back to, and I love, Tim, you framing it in the context of discipleship. So I think it can happen in the church, like geographically. I think it can happen as ministry of the church. Because there's what you're asking, there's so many different versions of like, okay, what does it look like to do something in the church or as part of the church? There's kind of this spectrum, and I think you see all kinds of examples of this. But maybe one part of that, and then Tim, I'd love to hear what your thoughts. But I think the church seeing biblical counseling as something that is a primary function of the church. And, so even for myself, our ministry is not a local church, but we look at what we're doing in very, very close relationship with the local church. We're in, all of our staff are in local churches. We're under the authority of elders. What we're doing is trying to help further the mission of the local church. So there's just relationship there, but it might, I think predominantly biblical counseling, at least my passion is to see the church really see that as part of a primary ministry that God calls us to, or calls all of us to, right? Because it's a ministry of disciple making, and who's called to make disciples? Well, all of us are called to make disciples. Yeah. So at one level, yes, it happens, or it ought to happen in and predominantly in the local church, just through people loving one another and caring for one another.
Yeah.
Amen. Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna kind of echo what he said. Counseling, I think, when I think in the context of the local church, I think the local church has all of these pathways of grace, right? Where the Spirit of God works to mature us into the image of Christ through the Word. And so whether it's preaching, teaching, ordinances, fellowship, small group, or the discipleship of biblical counseling, I think those are all avenues of grace and truth, working in our hearts, Ephesians 4:15, growing us as we hear the truth spoken in love. We grow up in every way into Him who is the head. But then I also think of Pallison's JBC article, Counseling is the Church. And I came to mind when I saw your question. I was like, he says there that therapists sometimes dream that counseling services might become truly community-based. People's problems, I'm going to just read a little bit of David Pallison. He said, people's problems play out in the home, in the workplace, and on the street amid relationships, but secular counselors have been almost powerless to realize their dream of what's needed to get the job done. And he's like, writing to pastors here, like, you are living their dream. You work within the ideal community context. The church's DNA includes wise counseling in daily life by people who already know and love each other. Mm. And I just think that's just beautiful. Like, that is, that was kind of Pallison's dream. It's like, this is the ultimate goal we're trying to see enacted in counseling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's such a beautiful vision. And as we talk, I realize how many of the words we're using we have to define in order to be able to use them, right? So defining biblical counseling, defining what we mean by in the context of the local church. I think even behind that is our definition of the local church, right? It's what is that? So for it to take place in the context of the local church, it has to be, we have to recognize what the church is, right? And so I think this is what, you're both getting at in a sense. And I think, Tim, you're getting at these means of grace that God gives to the church, whether it's the ordinances and things like that. The church being a committed gathering, a committed local gathering of believers under the care of pastor elders, right? Seems like at the baseline, the definition of what we mean by in the context of the local church. And so what we mean is it's then in the context of these relationships, these committed relationships in a locale to one another in the church, whether that's through formal membership or not, but there's a committedness to one another that also takes place under the care of localized pastor elders. Would you add anything to that? Like, that's just kind of what's coming to my mind as I'm thinking about what the local church is and what it means that we're saying these counseling primarily should take place within these relationships, these committed relationships, and under the care of pastor elders.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything there?
No, I think, maybe this is an addition to that. There's something so unique about what you just described, which is, I think, a great description of the church, and that's that this is a God ordained, God called, God created reality, family. It's not an organization. It's not a club. It's not a 501c. It is in some ways a mysterious, messy, glorious, beautiful reality of people who would not normally hang out together now becoming family, which is why it can be messy and awkward sometimes. But we're stuck together, or the better word is we're committed, but because of God's design and God's calling. It's not even just hey, I've made this commitment to you because I want to, be about something bigger than myself. It's like God has called us and joined us together. And so I think that just is so unique in that we're a family, we're divinely called to care for one another and be in each other's lives, knowing and loving one another, caring, walking with each other in our journey of sanctification. So that's just so different and so unique. And I think you put counseling into that context, and it's like, well, that's why it primarily should happen there, at least in my understanding. So it's like, well, because that's God's divine means of our sanctification. It's the primary place and means is the relationship of the family of God through all those means that you've talked about, and that's how he's designed it, purposed it. Yeah. And purposed our growth and transformation and healing.
It's such.
I love
so
that
beautiful.
Collective. Sorry.
No.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Sorry. Yeah, I'm probably just gonna do a doxology like you, brother. I love that collective commitment to discipleship. Like that is what the church is we're collectively committed to each other's discipleship. If someone says, "Where can I serve in our church?" I'm like, "Hey, there's 100 members. That means we have 100 ministries. You can serve." That is the bigger focus rather than join this, specific label ministry. Like, we are committed to each other, to disciple one another, to care for one another, and to walk toward Christ together.
Okay, so that's such a beautiful vision, and we see it so clearly in Scripture, and it's as you said, that was what Pallison was dreaming about and describing for biblical counseling. It's what every, secular or professional therapist dreams they had for the people under their care. So why would counseling ever take place outside of that, right? Why would it ever take place in a relationship that isn't a part of that local church? I mean, it feels like a really easy step from what we just described so it should always take place within those relationships, under those pastors, in that care. And I think that's a small step that lots of people make, right? They're like, because this is so beautiful, this is what it should always be. Why might it be beneficial or needed in situations for the biblical counseling to take place outside of that? Or is there no reason? And Jason, are you rethinking everything?
Is this an intervention? You guys designed this to just call me to repentance?
That's right.
Well, I mean, can I talk about why I think Jason's ministry is so important to our church?
Yeah.
And I think, because I think that's kind of getting to it. One of my joys of being a counseling pastor is I regularly get to have conversations with pastors from around the world who want to consider biblical counseling for their church. And in pretty much every conversation, I'm always recommending that they send their people to the Gospel Care Collective or a ministry like that while they are building up their church's counseling ministry. Because for someone to walk with another person in trouble, in the midst of their trouble, right, it takes training, it takes expertise, it takes maturity, it takes understanding Scripture, and honestly, it takes a love, right, for the ministry. If 1 Peter 5:2 says like we should be eager to shepherd the flock, and I think many pastors are they're just starting their training, or they need to refer people, or maybe a pastor is they're really great biblical counselors, but they know their limits. And it's not wise for them to do everything. So they know that in addition to caring in this way, they're going to need parachurch ministries to refer, like Gospel Care Collective. So, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about financially supporting the Gospel Care Collective, it really is not just I got to say this though, it's not just an investment in the Gospel Care Collective. It's an investment in supporting countless local churches that do need this help and support. So I do want to say that. Like, I mean, our church has a robust counseling ministry, but like last year, our abuse support group for women filled up. So thankfully, there were parachurch abuse support groups for victims that we could refer them to that was biblically counseling based. And so I just got to say, like, I'm thankful for you, brother, Jason.
Thanks,
I mean,
man.
you too, Scott, but Jason, for your ministry. And yeah. Okay. Yeah. I want to plug it because it's so important.
Yeah, for sure.
We need it.
For sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I believe in it, but I do wrestle with it. It's a tension that I live with. And I think I would say that it's an important tension to live with. Like, I don't ever want to get rid of the tension per se, because the tension that I'm talking about is this tension of like the church is the bride of Christ, and whatever I'm doing as a parachurch is to come alongside, right? That's para, like come alongside, but it's actually, and there may be a better word for para than parachurch, and it's because it's more than just coming alongside and kind of doing what the church is doing when the church can't do it. And that's oftentimes what a parachurch ends up functioning like. You know, like you can't sufficiently disciple your college students, so we'll do that. You know, we'll do it really well, and hopefully they'll end up back in the church, or you know, it's just, we see this in all kinds of ministries. It's sort of like where there's gaps in the ministry of the church, parachurches sort of fill in, and then operate sort of parallel to the church. I want our ministry to do is to be more than just a parallel kind of ministry filling the gaps, but to really partner with and come alongside and meet the needs that the church would bless the church and serve the church, but hopefully help the church grow in, and exactly what you're saying, Tim, like they may be at the very beginning, but is there some ways that we can serve the church to supplement the care? And I like that word, like we're supplementing the care that the church is providing, and then hopefully they're growing in that, and they'll be able to provide more and more and more care, and we can just continue to supplement it and provide training, provide equipping and encouragement. Specialized care, I think, is another piece that we can provide as well. So that's how I see it. But there is that tension that I'm not doing this as the bride. You are. So I always want to champion what you're doing primarily.
Okay. Can I almost want to correct that a little bit though, Jason, because like you're not doing it as the local life, but you are doing it as the bride, right? Like you're still a part of the big C church, right? We're not like outsourcing this outside of Christ's bride in that sense.
Right. Yeah, I think some where the tension comes is, yes, I agree with you, but when somebody comes to us, that's where I feel it. Like if, I get we get people referred to us for individual counseling, families, marriages.
Yeah.
They don't feel like they're being cared for by their church necessarily, in that, like particularly, but I want them to feel that. So I love it when like they get referred, that it's like, man, your church is caring for you by referring to us, and we want to like maintain that connection and relationship with your church where we can. Like what we're doing is an extension of, or
Yeah.
a part of the care that your church is providing to you, just even in them kind of connecting us. But that doesn't always happen. Like
Yeah.
people still sort of, churches and individuals still kind of look at us like, man, thankfully you exist, so I can send my people to you to care for them. I think that's happening less and less, and more. I mean, praise God, more pastors are looking to us as a partner. But
Okay. So like, I think an external counseling ministry like that, I mean, what I hear both of you saying is that they exist. I mean, a couple of reasons come to my mind as you talk. Like, one is simply because of the limited capacity of particular local churches, right? Like a specific local church might have a limited capacity in their ability to care for people. And so a parachurch can kind of come along, a counseling ministry can come along and help with some particularly intense situations. And that capacity might be time capacity. It also might be expertise capacity, right? Like somebody might be struggling in with a situation that people in that particular local community just have no familiarity with. And so there's I don't mean like expertise as in like an expert, but there's an experience, a training, an equipping, a knowledge base there as well. And it also seems like you might get counseling outside of a local church for the sake of development, right? As a local church does develop, for the sake of training, for the sake of growing in that sense.
I liken it to, and you guys tell me what you think about this, but because we've come across over the years, those within the biblical counseling world that, question, can you charge for counseling? Not only should, the counseling happen outside the local church, but can you even charge for it? So that's been a sort of a related issue that's come up and connected to this as well. But one of the ways that I've thought about it over the years is, the church ought to be the primary place of discipling men and women in the study of the Word of God and understanding the Word of God. The church ought to be the primary place to raise up deacons, elders, pastors, right? I think we would all agree with that.
Yeah.
It's, yes, the church, raise up. It's biblical. You see it in the scriptures, but I think all of us went to seminary, and churches love seminaries. We bless, we support seminaries. We pay a lot,
we
people
pay
a lot of money.
Yeah.
To go to seminary. Churches support the seminaries, and seminaries are not churches. They're connected to the church. They're maybe parachurch in essence, but they're for a specialized, season. They are training up people in God's word for the sake of the furtherance of discipleship and the building up of the church. So I liken what we're doing kind of to the seminary in a sense. Like we're not the church. We come alongside the church. We lift up the church and see ourselves in the spectrum of discipleship, or the paradigm of discipleship. But there's a place for specialized counseling in seasons of suffering and sin, specialized counseling for trauma and abuse, addictions, a lot of things that the church just maybe isn't, they could care for at a basic level, but that intensive nature, they may not in a lot of cases aren't equipped for. Just like, the church could raise up their own pastors and leaders and train them in the Bible, but there's a blessing in sending them to a really great seminary to learn from those who are particularly trained at teaching the Bible. And that's all they do full time. So that's helped me at least kind of think of that relationship and that difference.
I really like that analogy, actually. I don't think I've ever thought of it exactly that way, but it's super clarifying. And particularly because I guess I have thought after years of local church ministry, right? I mean, just my heart and ministry context primarily in the local church, but involvement with different parachurches in different ways. One of the ways that I think about it and summarize in my head is that the best parachurch ministries are the ones that serve the church, right? The ones that buttress and strengthen the church, as opposed to simply serving Christians in replacement of the church, right? Yeah. When we serve people in replacement of the church, I think that's where parachurches get wonky and weird. But when they serve the church, and sometimes they serve the church, I mean, obviously they serve the church by serving people, right? But when they see themselves as kind of fundamentally there to help buttress the church, as opposed to just kind of replace it because it's not doing its job, then it's a joy when the church takes on the things that the parachurch has been doing, not a threat, right? Because that's what we're there for all along.
It just reminds me of like other parachurch organizations that do a really good job, like yours. But I like sometimes I'll go speak at like Asian American Christian Fellowship at UCLA or USC, and they start every single gathering with "We are not the church." There's a clipboard going around with rides to different churches in our area that are, we are here to build you up and to connect you to the local church, to serve you, to connect us together as Christians on this campus, but we are not the church. And then they go into what the church is. And so, and I know like for your counseling ministry and your focus, that's what you want the people you counsel to be connected to that more holistic discipleship structure of that God designed.
Well, yeah, especially so when, you mentioned this earlier, Tim, like, and I think maybe Pallison hit that, like the role of community and even how secular therapists see and admit the limitations of just one-on-one counseling and that therapeutic relationship. That's limited. That's not an ongoing, regular, communal relationship that is so integral to health and healing and growth. And so, that idea that, man, like this is helpful and this can be beneficial, this one-on-one kind of relationship that happens once a week or however, the rhythm is. But man, for you to have a community of people that know you and and love you and care for you, wow, that's transformative. That's why things like AA are so powerful. Because it comes back to that community of people that are in the same situation, and you're not alone in this. So that's what it's like. If I can't do what I'm doing apart from the local church or from community and relationship. Let's put it that way. Well, gosh, and that's exactly what the church is, right? God, that's because God knows, and that's how He created us. Everything, the world just tries to do it, as best they can.
And I gotta say, I feel the tension within my own church between like our counseling ministry and our church community. So like, I feel like in some ways having a counseling ministry in the church can almost feel like you have your own parachurch ministry in the church. And so that like, I feel that's because, so like whatever, whenever someone comes in with a presenting problem for counseling, we always say there's a co-presenting problem of community. How do we always ask like, who else is praying for you? Who else is coming alongside you? Who else can be part of the circle of care? And so there's ripples of this burden going out into the church so that we can really fulfill like that. If one member suffers, the whole body suffers. Not that everybody knows everything about those who are in trouble, but like that, that there is an experience of like my church family cares for me. And it's not just, we have this ministry in the corner of our church where we send everybody to that has a burden. And I'll tell people like, if that is people's experience of the love of God, that the love of God for those who suffer, it lives in this tiny corner of the church called the counseling ministry, then His love is going to feel puny and tiny, and there's like a waiting list for it. But if if burdens are shared in the body, then his love is going to feel massive. And if we're equipping the whole body to be this culture of counseling and care, of Christ-like love, that honors and that loves, that walks with, does that long journey together, his love is going to feel like what it should feel like. Like the whole body will be reverberating with this amazing love. And then worship will grow, and really God will be magnified, which is what we want. So I feel that tension too. Yeah.
I think it's really insightful to even think about the kind of parachurchness of even a counseling ministry, right? I think that's really insightful. And just like we see oftentimes within a local church, the counseling ministry as a place where people are for an intensive, as a road into community, right? I think that at its best, I would imagine that parachurch counseling ministries at their best are a road into the local church, maybe for people who are disconnected, who maybe for a number of different reasons in our fallen world, with fallen hearts, with the things that they've experienced, aren't ready or able to engage with the local church, but can be brought to a place where they can enter back in at its best.
Yeah, I think that's significant because community sounds great and it's God's design, right? But how many people are hurt in community, in relationship, hurt by the church? In many ways, we're hearing those stories are becoming amplified in these days, but it's real, and so how does the church care for those that it's hurt? And I think it can and it must, and we really need to wrestle through that. But we do see one of the benefits of being a ministry that's connected to the church, but not the church, is that there can be a safety that is experienced in that. Our hope and prayer is always that in the process of care and that they're receiving in our, through our ministry, is that they would be back in the church, or they would experience reconciliation and healing in the church and through the church. And we would be, maybe be able to play a small part in helping facilitate that or encourage that. If anything, we're praying for that. But, timelines on that are just, different for each person. So we've seen that. We're seeing that. I want to say maybe more and more too.
Yeah, I'm so thankful to even hear you describe that, because I also think that that's in a fallen world with fallen people in the church, that's a big component of this too. Like creating places that, in one sense, if you were to draw it up in a model, like you're like, no, that's not the ideal, like that's not the primary place that this takes place. But sometimes because of the consequences of sin and suffering, something we need, it's a way we can go to people, right? It's a way we can meet them in their pain and in their suffering without saying, no, if you want care, you gotta, enter into the local church when your experience has been really painful. Now, even if that's ultimately the goal, right? But at the same time, that goal, I guess by saying that, I don't necessarily mean the goal is that they reconnect and enter into the same local community that hurt them, right? I mean, it depends on what happens. The reconciliation is possible, but in our fallen world, there's a lot of mess, and there's a lot of wisdom needed, and there's a lot of help that's needed to navigate that. And I feel like without ministries like that, or that serve that purpose, we're kind of leaving people, or we're leaving brothers and sisters in Christ out on their own.
Or they go to secular counselors. Or they go to counselors who don't love the local church, who have been burned themselves by the local church, but want to help people. There's a lot of folks out there like that they're in their own journey, and so when it comes to counseling therapy, it's like the local church is not part of it. In fact, if it is a part of it, it's a hurtful part, and so let's just remove that from kind of whatever it is that we're walking through and trying to find healing in and through. And so, yeah, to be able to be a place that and have people ministering with expertise, with specialization, with high level of care, but also loving the church, or seeing where we all fit within the church. I think there's a real need for that, or an opportunity. That's why I think there's a great opportunity for those in our churches that feel called to the profession of counseling and want to do it as a licensed counselor. I think there's a category for that and a great opportunity for that. I look at it as discipleship, but mission. The evangelistic side of discipleship. There's a lot of folks that will go to a secular or not a secular counselor, but a counselor that's not connected to the church, that is licensed, because they're looking for somebody who's licensed, and they, but if that person happens to be a gospel-centered, church-loving Christian that sees their role in providing that care on the continuum of discipleship, there's a huge opportunity there. And I think they can do biblical counseling in that context.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful vision. I think. The complexities of that. That's probably a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I don't want to open a can of worms, but
no. But I guess I think that there's a lot of questions there, and it is because it is messy and difficult. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not worth striving to figure out how to navigate and how to navigate well. And for people with those callings to step into, strive to figure out. So, yeah. And honestly, it's there's a lot of those questions that those are even big questions that I still have, just being a pastor and in my context, right? There's a lot of those things that I haven't ever had to totally figure out. But I'm excited to walk with people, and I think it's part of why parachurch, in that sense, organizations that serve the church, can help provide experience, help provide a way forward from people who've navigated and are navigating it together. So, what about? I think that there's some really helpful and important reasons people might be blessed by counseling that's taking place outside of the context of the local church, but still loves the local church, right? And what we're saying, actually, and what I hear you saying, is that there's a place for biblical counseling that takes place outside of the local church. There's not a place for biblical counseling that doesn't love the local church.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Is that okay?
I don't think you could call it biblical then. You're right.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. I like. Yeah. How can you love Christ and not love His bride? Right. If someone came over and loved me or whatever, but just kept complaining about my wife, I would be asking them to leave pretty quickly. Right. So you got to love the bride.
Yeah. Okay. So, but people might pursue that for all sorts of different reasons, right? Sometimes because there's specific hurt, maybe because they're not a part of a local community. They may even get referred from their local community to some people that can help with particular experience or expertise or things like that. I think one of the reasons, though, people tend to look outside of their local church is because there's this kind of cultural value of someone objective, like someone who doesn't know me. I've tended, I'll show you my cards. I've tended to tell people that that's not helpful, right? That the instinct to be counseled by someone that doesn't know you is more problematic than it's helpful. All these other factors aside, but what do you guys think? Is it a benefit? Are there benefits? Are there drawbacks from someone that's like quote unquote objective? Or how should we think about that instinct in ourselves or in those in our local churches? Does that instinct, first of all, does the question make sense? You resonate with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know that like we want the relationships that know each other, the best, to be equipped to love each other the best. I think that's kind of the whole end game of discipleship in a community. It's like you're committed to one another, you know one another for a long time, and you are then equipped to love with great wisdom and care. I think that's a really good goal. But yeah, I think when people have been hurt in the church and things like that, it takes time. And honestly, even if they haven't been hurt, it just takes time for trust to reach a level where you can feel very vulnerable and confident that they're going to speak the truth in love to me. And so when I'm, like I said, like there's those two co-presenting problem. Like I'm trying to build up that person's community while I'm caring for them in the church. Like I just say take time and go deeper with vulnerability. Don't go all the way to the deep end of vulnerability right away in a relationship, but just see how someone responds to those prayer requests, to those small disclosures, to the everyday anxieties and worries you feel. And I'd say the same thing when people are building accountability partners. Just take your time, see how they handle that. Like Paul Tripp says, the fine china, and that if they handle it in a Christ-like way, then you can share more. But I would say the blessing of that kind of outside, quote unquote, objective counselor is there are other guarantees for that trust, right? There's policies, there are standards of care, there's promises of confidentiality, there's supervision, and there is a professional, their job is to speak the truth in love in partnership with the local church. So I think that it is a goal that our closest relationships in the church mature together, we share life together, we grow to be like Christ together. But there are definitely times where it's helpful to have that more while you're building those relationships up and while those relationships are getting equipped, that to have the outside help.
So just to clarify though, so by outside help though, you're talking about like added experience, knowledge, expertise. You're not necessarily talking about the virtue of someone being like quote unquote objective. Like it's not just beneficial because they're outside or don't have a relationship with you. Or are you?
And I mean, I'd say like that's why people come to the counseling ministry too. Is like they'll say we want someone objective, like someone who's not in the midst of this. I think a lot of marriage counseling starts off that way, right? Like we want an objective opinion giver. And I don't know. I think there can be some virtue in that of like I'm not the husband's best friend, and now I'm going to counsel the wife. So I think you just have to know what those connections are and what the potential things that could come up for that counselor. But I think on certain levels, but I would say, objective isn't like, I don't know, like we're all going to have things that we bring to a counseling session where we're not objective. Like no one is truly objective and unbiased.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have had a number of folks come to me for counseling because I'm outside of their context, and in fact, I had a pastor a number of months ago come to me for counseling I was super encouraged. I mean, his relationships, he had deep relationships locally with his own elders, with, friends in his church, friends in town. I mean, it was really kind of a rare situation, but he said, I'm getting counsel from these people, but they all kind of are, have, knowledge and that is absolutely beneficial, but they're also impacted by me and how, and the things that I'm seeking counseling for. And so he said, I just would love to do some counseling with somebody who's completely outside of my context, who might be able to ask me questions that they're not going to ask me. And maybe you won't. This is the beautiful thing. He's like, maybe this will just be kind of repeating the same things, but for the sake of just letting God shine his light and search my heart and to know me and to really seek the wisdom of those I can with the resources that I have and that sort of thing. He said, I want to kind of do everything I can to get the best wisdom and counsel possible. So I think that was helpful for him. It felt like he had another space along with that felt a little bit more objective, and he had a little bit more safety with me to really kind of be honest about some parts of his life that in those relationships back home, he had to sort of check himself and say, would this be wise for me? Like kind of what you're saying, Tim, like, is this wise for me to be this vulnerable with this person? Like, am I going to overburden them, or am I going to create in them a question mark? Or am I going to, not bad things, but just he had to sort of check himself all the time and navigate that. And with me, it was like, he was totally free. He's like, we may do 2 sessions and I'll never see you again until glory. So there was a safety to just be like, blah, here it is. Like, and a freedom to not have to think about what he was telling me and what I was going to think or how I was going to be impacted. That I think was a benefit for him. But again, he had those subjective relationships, and so I think what you're asking is like people are looking for it, like, and I think that's a valid concern or valid like check for you as a pastor, for sure.
Yeah, I love that word you used, like alongside, right? There's in that sense a value add, like a significant value add here, right? There's and to me it sounds like the wisdom of a plethora of counselors, right? You're getting, there is a value to voices outside of your most immediate and maybe most intimate relationships. Like there's some benefit there. I think in one sense, what I push back against is the assumption that the outside is fundamentally the best, right? That's where all the wisdom is. But even as you guys are talking, I feel like my mind's being corrected here a little bit, like I'm being shaped a little bit, because in response to that instinct that says the outside's the best, I want to say, no, it's not. Inside's the best, right? Inside's the best, and it's all you need. And I think what I hear you saying is the wisdom that comes in recognizing that there's blessing in these different contexts, and we can appreciate that without having to like sell out to one exclusive extreme that says this is what everybody needs and all everybody needs. Yeah.
Well, and even Scott, as you're talking, like inside may be best for this particular struggle, moment, season in your life.
Yeah.
Like this is what God has for you right now. But in another time, in another moment of your life, some outside counsel might actually be the best thing you need. And sometimes it's going to be both. And so I think, thinking about it in terms of, man, we're always in, being sanctified and in need of grace and help. And so there's many moments in our life where we're going to need the counsel of those within and possibly without, outside. And it can just vary depending on the nature of who's available, nature of the issue, those sorts of things. That would be maybe the other thing I would add to that.
Yeah.
It's just the openness of how God's going to provide the care and the help, and what's that going to look like in this moment.
Yeah, because it's all, in one sense, it's all going to feed back to and point us back to life in the local church. But that doesn't mean that everything that points us there has to like kind of be within the bounds of my local church. Like there is this big C church that God uses whether it's outside counsel or it's a book or it's seminary or it's right. Like there's
Right.
big C church voices and blessings
Yeah.
that we can glean from that strengthen the local church in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's important for churches to be wise in those partnerships, those outside partnerships, so really evaluate, does this Christian conciliation, ministry, or does this counseling ministry, how is it going to complement the vision of this church? I've counseled pastors who've used, different maybe church revitalizing ministries or things like that have come in and actually done damage to the church. So I think it's just really important to evaluate that carefully because especially if you're doing, like opening your whole church up to something, really evaluate it because, is it biblical? Is this Christ-centered? Is this in harmony with the vision of the church and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really good. Because as that one of those ministries, I just want to echo that and say I love it when a church says to me like, "Hey, we have questions. Like we're not just going to refer people to you, or like we want to know you. We want to know your theology. We want to know your ecclesiology. Do you align with us?" And I'm like, "Man, I'll talk to you. However, I'll give you as much time as you need. I want you to trust." And ideally, would love for us to be able to partner together, as opposed to just being a, website with some, bios that you kind of say sounds good. Let me just, send people your way. Man, if we can partner together and there can be a trust in that, then yes. Now, obviously, on our website, we want to be clear, like about our theology and about our ecclesiology and those things, but. Yeah, it can do damage if you pick the wrong ministry to partner with.
Because we're talking about relationships here, right? That we have to know one another well enough to have that trust. I mean, that's where earlier, Jason, you used the analogy. You're like, this isn't organization; it's family, right?
Yeah.
The church is family. The local church is family, and so in that sense, we're not even necessarily talking about inside the organization versus outside the organization. We're really kind of talking about immediate family versus extended family, right? We're
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Yeah. Well,
we write
like
that down. Tweet that.
The picture I get, and we're kind of maybe in the same phase of life, is a daughter who starts dating, and you're like, okay, that boy starts hanging around. You're like, do we want him hanging around? Do we want him to be part of the family? He's because at some point he's going to become more and more part of the family. Possibly.
Just because you can offer the services doesn't mean we want you a part of the family, right?
Yeah. Will we let you date our daughter? I don't know how that fits, but yeah.
All right, so just maybe a couple other questions. One, I mean, since we've come all the way, we've talked about different contexts and inside the outside the local church, parachurch. I want to hear your thoughts, because I know, Jason, you do increasingly more of this, especially since COVID. But how in that context, do you think about in-person versus virtual counseling? And that might be a huge other, but I think that these same principles apply in a similar way. So I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on both the virtue or necessity, or how should we think about kind of utilizing technology like this for counseling.
Yeah, I think it's another one of those tensions that I just choose to live with and actually invite into my life, because it on the one hand, in person is ideal. Like you look at the end of Ephesians, Paul's writing a letter. There's sort of it's sort of a virtual communication. It's in writing, right?
Yeah.
It's but though writing it by hand and delivering it, he's not there in person. There's a value in that communication and his heart being shared with the churches through writing. But you see even in Paul saying, I want to be with you, or I'm going to send this person to be with you, and they're going to reiterate what I've shared with you. And so I think just biblically embodied, tangible relationships are what we're created for and made for, and it are really, really critical, probably in more ways than we realize, that what that does for us when we're together with somebody in person. It's different when we're together, when we get to meet up, the three of us, and
totally.
Than even this. It's so much happens in the unplanned, unintentional moments. When you're walking to the place where you're going to sit down and talk, like there's those moments of connection, relationship that are really significant. But on the other side, virtual enables us to care and communicate in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do because of the limitations of location and geography. So in terms of counseling, we're able to help a lot of people that wouldn't have access to good, gospel-centered, church-loving counseling because they don't have anything locally. They don't have anything available in their local church or community. So to be able to see someone virtually who can virtually partner with their church has been, I think it's just a huge, huge blessing. And then we're also building a lot more relationship with churches around the country and even internationally with churches that we can now help develop a vision for counseling, develop some training in counseling. And so that's just, it's open. Virtual has opened a door of opportunity and equipping and training that just wasn't there before, or was maybe could have been there, but it was much more limited. So it's this tension we live in. I think like it's both and. Like I think let's do both and live with that.
I think it's so similar in that sense, right? Because there's an ideal and a primary, but in our fallen world and with our limited capacities, there's also opportunities that the Lord uses as blessings that we can take too far if we use as replacements, but can be really powerful tools. So
I think that category of replacement is helpful. Like we never want to do this in the way virtual should never replace. Like just like Paul, letters never replaced the personal, in-person, relational kind of ministry that happened. But it was a really vital. Like if he didn't write letters, if we didn't have those letters, where would we be today? Where would the church be today? God ordained a personal relation. If he could have just said, well, hey, I'm going to reveal myself, and my word is through people, passing my word on, person to person to person through relationship, and that's it. But in His infinite wisdom, we have the written word. So I think there's something there, but it doesn't. It enhances and grounds the relationship that is personal. So even all virtual counseling should just aim to deepen physical, embodied relationship. That's how I would see it.
It's really insightful.
And I just want to add that, it's done so much to allow our counselors to counsel and people to receive counseling that normally wouldn't be able to get it. I know you just like childcare, it is now like, if you can get childcare now, some of my, like the women in our church who counsel, they can take on more counseling because the kid's in the next room. And I don't know, it just actually is people living with chronic pain. There's just so many ways that remote has allowed us to love and disciple. It's just allowed discipleship to grow in our church. So I'm thankful. But the ideal is that in person, Paul's letters, the most frequent command is greet one another with a holy kiss. You got to be in person, to give a hug or whatever, to just, it's just so important to be together. So.
That's so helpful. And I think that wisdom the wisdom puts us in the place where we can see the benefits of these opportunities and take advantage of them out of love for people, while not kind of glomming onto or trying to pigeonhole all discipleship into one of these different formats, right? Whether it's parachurch or I was calling it virtual. Tim, what did you just call it?
Oh, remote.
Remote.
Or, I don't know what.
All of a sudden, I was like, whatever word you said was better. That's a better word than virtual counseling. I'm not sure it's virtual, but remote. I like remote. Anyways, all right. Well, maybe one last just kind of sum up question. I mean, when you think about how the opportunities or emphases on the context for biblical counseling is talked about and viewed and facilitated within the biblical counseling movement. If you were to take a step back, how do you hope we might continue to grow and be sharpened as a movement as we think about the kind of where and how of counseling and where taking place? I know it's a big question, but I'd love to maybe wrap up with any closing thoughts kind of on that big picture question, if either of you have them.
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the church. Like we've hit on a bunch here, the church really seeing counseling as part of the continuum of discipleship, and not just a ministry that would be nice to have. Like it's like, oh, that'd be so great, but we've got to get a youth ministry going. We got to get a women's ministry, a men's ministry. Counseling's kind of down, number 7 or 8 on the priority list, or wherever. I know a lot of churches like that would be amazing, but that's more of a mid-sized mega church sort of benefit of having that kind of ministry, but really more churches thinking in terms of a care culture, that we would have such a culture that one another care is happening, and people really are experiencing kind of relationships where they're not alone in their sin and their suffering. And so I think that's my prayer is to see that happening more and more, where the church sees their place and sees counseling and care as part of what God is calling them to do. And part of that, is connected to another passion of mine is seeing counseling, biblical counseling, grow in our understanding of what it means to care for people as embodied souls. So the whole person, not just the soul, but the body and soul. And so there's more and more conversations happening around that. How do we care for the whole person, and not be Gnostic in our approach, where we're just mostly caring for the spiritual part of us, but it's so trauma comes into that, and some of those things. And I think so but put those two together, like the church is an embodied community. It's a tangible, embodied community. There's physical realities, whether we're aware of it or not, that are happening in whenever we gather and meet and greet each other with a holy kiss, or our version of that today. Like that's so significant, and so I think if this makes sense, there's a connection between the two as the church really grows in its understanding of care and counseling as discipleship. Well, I think the conversation around caring for one another as embodied souls, physical and spiritual, is going to benefit from that. That's my hope. That's my prayer.
Appreciate that. And what's really encouraging to me is I think there's a lot of real sharpening that goes on there. Again, maybe to go back to the seminary analogy, right? Like the local church is sharpened by the theological rigor that takes place in a seminary. Now, every pastor, that doesn't mean that every pastor is going to live out the theological rigor that he, contained in seminary, right? That to be faithful, he has to maintain his Hebrew translation or whatever.
Right.
But that existing is going to sharpen, and it's going to feed conversations, and they're going to go back, and the church is going to be strengthened. And I feel like in a lot of ways that's one of the exciting things that the Lord continues to do in the church and in the biblical counseling movement is through these conversations we're sharpened, we're growing together. What about you, Tim?
Oh man, I have so many things that I have prayers for in biblical counseling. I've started 30 blogs, and I'm like, oh man, I just got to think about this other thing now. And so my mind is always racing with this question. But I would say, if I had to choose one thing, I think churches need to learn to come alongside churches. So I think parachurch organizations are wonderful, and they will always be necessary to build up certain areas of weakness, to meet certain needs. But churches need to connect with each other and dream about what a holistic vision of building up a community of God should look like. And like how counseling is not just a ministry you tack on, but it is part of the whole body loving one another with wisdom. So the way you train your preschool, Sunday school teacher, the way you preach to the heart and to relationships on a Sunday, every aspect needs to be about this discipleship focus and culture of care. So I think like with that sense, then everything is targeting the worship of the heart so that Christ is being made preeminent in every aspect of ministry. Idols are being seen and cast down, and we're helping one another across the board in every ministry. And I think that's just the way the church is meant to function, so that we are really living out our full identity as a church and as individuals to live for the praise of His glorious grace. And but I think churches can come alongside churches. I feel like in some ways what I do, like, as a counseling pastor, I train counselors, I counsel, I supervise, but we also do consults with other churches. And I think this is the thing I see churches longing for, like, help me rethink church in a sense. And we've talked about seminaries, and we've talked about, other parachurch organizations, but there is an institutional void of having this vision of what a church is to be. And I love that Jason and others are helping churches realize that vision. But I think churches need to have this vision and help each other have this vision. So that's
we need to own it.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, it's like, Tim, your church is a church that me as a parachurch, as I consult with other churches, I can point them to your church and say, well, here's a great example of a church that's doing it. And so, that's huge when a church can look at another church and say, oh my goodness, okay, it is possible. Like, that's one example of what it looks like. It's not just theory, but it's actual reality. And then to have available what you're describing, that kind of relationship, that kind of openness to say, man, we want to help in whatever way. It's all of us, big C, small C church working together in harmony. I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah. That's I think both such a beautiful vision, and I think as we grow as Christians, as pastors, that's what we get to experience together. I mean, I in one sense too, that's what you're describing, even just in that ways I've been so sharpened and blessed by your friendships and our proximity here in Southern California, at least relative proximity. We're all in Southern California, right? But just the ability to connect, be sharpened, even this conversation, I feel like has like clarified even for me some ideas that have floated around and tensions that I felt, and not known exactly how to put them into words. This has been clarifying in a number of different ways. And I think it just continues to sharpen us, sharpen the church, sharpen one another, sharpen our people as we glean from one another, see the strengths and the blessings and the ways that the Lord works our weaknesses to His glory in all of our different ministries and contexts and churches. And so and it's such a blessing, such a joy to get to be a part of. And I'm super thankful for you brothers, most primarily just as friends, and for the opportunity to get to do stuff like this together too.
It's mutual.
Amen.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your generosity. Thanks for the time. I think we'll leave it there, and the next time we hang out, it'll be in person and not recorded, and so it'll be, we'll get the full embodied experience.
Yeah. Nice.
But
yes,
over some good coffee. But
Sounds good.
Thanks again for the generosity of your time today, guys. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. I hope that you were as sharpened and as encouraged as I was by our conversation. I hope that even as a result of our conversation, you both were able to catch more and more of a vision for God's heart for discipleship and his love for the local church, and all the things and all the ways that is strengthened through local churches, through relationships in local churches, through parachurches, as he strengthens his bride and leads us forward. So we'll leave it there. It's a blessing, you guys. Thank you again, and thank you for listening. We will see you next time.